Hello everyone, I'm your host, Jazzy Mitchell. Welcome to the first episode of History in Your Backyard, Asylum Edition. Today, I will be talking about the Rockland Psychiatric Center. It's located in Rockland County, New York. I'm sure some of you will be able to recognize this place. It's been around for almost 100 years now. Can you believe that? Almost 100 years old. And I can guarantee that most of you don't know the history behind it. Well, don't worry. That's what I'm here for. In this episode, I'll give you all a brief history lesson about this fascinating little institution. Let's begin. During the 1920s and 1930s, it was the beginning for the Rockland Psychiatric Center. But why was it created? Well, on February 18, 1923, the Manhattan State Hospital on Ward's Island, an island in New York City, caught on fire and killed 25 people. 22 were patients and the remaining 3 were attendants. Because of the fire, they needed to relocate the remaining survivors. Orangeburg, a town in Rockland County, New York, was selected as the site of a new facility to relocate the patients of Manhattan State Hospital, as well as relieve the overcrowding in other psychiatric hospitals. In 1926, the hospital was built and later opened in 1930, named the Rockland State Hospital, and had its first patient admitted in 1931. They also had a children's hospital in 1936, which was separated from the other buildings. It was a massive facility with 550 acres of land and over 5,000 beds for men, women, and children that were admitted into the facility. The patients had a garden to grow crops, which the hospital would use for food, and the patients also had hard labor jobs, such as making mattresses, brooms, and furniture. The doctors thought that hard labor would help with the mentally ill. Though, like most asylums at the time, Rockland State Hospital was no stranger to using horrible procedures on patients to treat them. Some of those treatments included insulin shock therapy and electroconvulsive therapy. Here's an example of insulin shock therapy. It's pretty disturbing, so please, viewer discretion is advised. How horrible was that, right? And that was just one procedure. Imagine all the other types of procedures and treatments they did on those people back then. And there are a lot. But let's not get too crazy with that. There's still a lot more to go about this crazy asylum. Next up is what I would consider the height of the Rockland State Hospital. This time period was the height of the Rockland State Hospital. It was very overcrowded, and at its peak in 1959, it had more than 9,000 patients and 2,000 staff members. By this time, they began to use hydrotherapy and lobotomies on their patients. In short, if you don't know what a lobotomy is, it was a procedure where the doctor would insert an ice pick into the patient's eye and shove it in until they reached the frontal lobe, severed it, and helped calm the patient from their schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. But that's not all that happened. Unfortunately, in August of 1958, a patient had escaped from the hospital and made their way to a woman's house and murdered her. Here's the story behind that.
Escape patient kills woman, 31. The hospital authorities seek to determine how a man gained freedom. Mrs. Abraham Finkel, 31 of 38 Dutch Hollow Road, Orangeburg, was stabbed fatally shortly before 3 o'clock last Thursday afternoon by Leon Thomas, also 31, a mental patient who had escaped from Rockland State Hospital about an hour before. It was the first time since the hospital was opened in 1930 that an escaped patient had caused any serious bodily harm to anyone, although patients have managed to sneak out on other occasions.
It's not the best story out there. Speaking of stories, though, have you ever heard of Mary Jane Ward? She was an American novelist born in 1905. Her life took a turn after she was admitted into some mental hospitals, one of them being Rockland State Hospital. But that ultimately led her into writing her infamous book, The Snake Pit, in 1946, which later became an Oscar-winning film in 1948. Hear a little about it.
In keeping with a story of such popularity and significance, The Snake Pit comes to the screen with one of the finest casts that has ever been assembled. The starring role is perfect for Olivia de Havilland, her first since she won the Academy Award. Those who have seen her in The Snake Pit predict new triumphs for this talented actress. Her portrayal of the young girl who passes through the terrors of a mental breakdown to fulfill a happy romance is certainly the most challenging role ever played by a woman. Also starring in The Snake Pit are Mark Stevens as the young husband Robert Cunningham, and Leo Genn as the sympathetic Dr. Kick. Then there's Academy Award winner Celeste Holm as Grace, Glenn Langan as Dr. Terry, and a score of other well-known artists.
My head hurts. There's something the matter with my head.
Come on, darling, let me help you.
Who are you? Why do you torture me? Why do you lie to me?
Virginia, what is it? What's the matter? Don't you know me? I'm Robert, your husband.
Let me
Mary Jane Ward wasn't the only writer that had been locked up in mental hospitals at the time. A well-known poet, Allen Ginsberg, was admitted into the Pilgrim Psychiatric Center. There was a poem that he published back in 1956 called Howl. Pretty interesting, right? Don't worry, we'll talk more about it in a later episode. Next up is what I call the downfall of the Rockland State Hospital, and here's why. The 60s seemed like a calm period of time for the hospital. On the outside, it looked like the people were having a great time there. Here's an example. Wasn't that just really interesting to see? It was so lively. They all looked like they were having a good time there. But throughout the 70s, the number of patients began to really decrease. Why? Well, that's because of deinstitutionalization. I know, it's a big word. This is what it means.
Deinstitutionalization is the process of replacing long-stay psychiatric hospitals with less isolated community mental health services for those diagnosed with a mental disorder or developmental disability.
So, because of deinstitutionalization, the hospital had to shut down a majority of its buildings because no one was using it anymore. They didn't have enough patients or staff to keep those buildings up and running, so it just wasn't any use to them anymore. Also, in 1974, they had changed the name of the hospital from Rockland State Hospital to, you guessed it, Rockland Psychiatric Center. Pretty interesting, right? Now, we're on what I like to call the standstill. Nothing really happened during this time, but I'd still like to keep you guys informed. Since the majority of the facility was shut down in the 70s, by 1999 they had housed less than 600 patients. Isn't that a crazy contrast to them 40 years ago? 1959, over 9,000 patients, and now they only have less than 600. That blows my mind. Here we are, present day. This is where things get a bit interesting in my opinion. In 2003, New York State sold the former campus of all the old buildings that were no longer in use to the town of Orangetown. So now, Orangetown had the power to do whatever they wanted with that land. By 2010, the Children's Center got moved to where it is now. Here it is. Which made the secluded one now abandoned. Since the main building and Children's Center had been closed for some time now, there has been lots of vandalism in the buildings, and some people even dared to venture inside and document their journeys. I wanted to do that, and I wish I could have done that, but unfortunately, in 2017, the town of Orangetown sold the 60 acres of unused land with all those abandoned buildings to J.P. Morgan Chase for $7.5 million. In 2018, they began demolishing the buildings to get the land ready to bear their new data center. By 2019, they had finished construction and it was finally complete. This is what it looks like now. And there you have it, everyone. The history of the Rockland Psychiatric Center. Crazy how all of that was happening in the backyards of those of Orangetown. I absolutely loved digging deep into learning about this hospital's history. The one thing I have a problem with was just how they sold all that land to JP Morgan to make a data center of all things. I don't know, it just doesn't sit right with me. I think it would have been cool if they made like a little apartment complex for those, like the family of the patients or doctors even, you know? Just utilize the land. I don't know. Data center right next to a mental hospital just seems kind of bizarre. But oh well, what's done is done. If you enjoyed this episode, I'm sure you would love to learn more about the next place, Pilgrim Psychiatric Center. I'll be diving deep into its history and tell you all that I've learned. See you next time.